First thing we're going to do is look at our task top repositories. When we configure the PlanView Task Top Hub or the IBM Integration Hub, there are several pieces that have to be put together to make the integration work. So the first thing is to look at the repositories, and you'll note here that I have two repositories configured. The first being the Atlassian JIRA, the second being the Engineering Workflow Management. And we'll talk about why we configured this way in a few minutes. But one thing I wanted to note, first thing was, when we configure a repository connection, there are two things to bear in mind. You're not connecting to the project when you configure the repository. You're connecting to the URL, the base URL where you're going. And that's any of the JIRA Cloud configurations. But here I'm using my own Wade's pages at their .atlassian.net. And that's it. That's the end of the URL. Now, the next very important thing to remember is the type of connection. Now, the authentication method has a bearing on how you can connect and which environment you can connect to. For JIRA Cloud, you need an API token. That's how you have to connect to JIRA Cloud. All these other things don't work for that. These are just standard configurations for various authentication methods. Standard authentication works fine for the EWM environment, but does not work for JIRA. So we picked the API and our email address and API, and we included the email address and the API token. Now, what does that mean? Well, if we look into JIRA, we can go into the Wade user of the product or the user settings. We're going to go into Manage Account, and then we're going to go into the security of the managed account. If you scroll down here, you'll see that there's API tokens. Now, because I already have a managed token, I've got that. But when you click Create and Manage API Tokens, what that's going to do is going to create you a little file here. You're going to name it, whatever you're going to name it, and then it's going to give you a key. And that's your API token. You want to save that because that's what you're going to need to configure your repository connection. That's what goes right here. Once you've done that, you click Done. And then you validate that connection, and it should be just fine. The next repository we want to configure is our Engineering Workflow Management repository. To do that, we add a repository, new repository connection, and when we add that, we name it whatever we want to name it. This is just a name that you'll see in the repository connection area, and then we put the URL in again. Again, note that we're looking at the base URL for the configuration management page, the EWM page. Now, what does that look like? Basically, when we go into our EWM or our ELM environment, we want the part of this plus CCM. So when we go into our dashboard and we look at our engineering management project, in this particular case, I'm going to use Wade Demo 2. We're going to look at the up to the CCM piece of that. Note it is the URL /CCM. And when we go back into our repository configuration screen, we're looking at the CCM URL right there. The authentication method, which is different from the JIRA, is in this case the standard authentication. Now, what I've done is I've created a task top user, and that user has whatever access it needs to integrate with the tools, meaning this Wade task top user will have the appropriate rights. In this case, it's got a user access to the project or projects that we need to configure. The password for that is the ELM password for Wade task top. Once we've set that information, one thing to note here is connection security. Depending on how your network is configured, you may have to create a secure connection, a tunnel connection, IPsec tunnel, or TLS configuration, whatever the case may be, depending on how your network requires a connection. But just note that particular connection configuration may be something you have to work with. In this case, it doesn't have to be overly secure. Just the standard HTTPS is fine. We'll click Done. And as we did with the previous connection, I didn't change anything, so we're going to go back to this, and we're going to go back to repositories. Once we've configured that, again, we check that connection, and that is a valid connection. So now we have both connections are valid, and our repository connections are good. After you've configured your repositories, the next step is to look at the models. Now, I say look at the models because there are 10 of them already pre-created with the integration hub. Those are typically sufficient, with one exception. EWM requires a planned for field. So in each of the fields that I've configured a collection for, I have added in the model a planned for field, and then added the field values that are in that planned for field. In this particular project, I've got the release, sprint 1, sprint 2, backlog, and unassigned. Now, JIRA does not have all of those. It only has the sprint 1. But that's not a problem right now. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. In any case, just understand that models are the fields that exist between the projects and between the applications. This is the integration hub fields that tie back into the application fields. So each one of these fields should have a corresponding application field that will then translate to the other application in the synchronization process. That's about all we'll say about it for now, because the next important step is to go into your collections. Now, in this particular synchronization configuration, I have configured already 6 different collections. And the reason I did that is I want to connect epics, stories, and tasks from JIRA into EWM. To create a collection, you simply need to click New Collection, select Work Item Collection, call it something, go in and select your repository. I'm going to select the EWM side because I have multiple projects that we can select from, but that is the repository we configured a few minutes ago. And then you go in and select the projects. And the reason I did the EWM side first is you select from whatever project you want to integrate. And that's very important because if you've got a whole bunch of projects in your application, you are integrating or synchronizing a project in this particular configuration. And then we select that, and we're done. Once you have selected your project, you then select the work item. Now, I've already selected epic, story, and task, so it may not like that. So I'm going to select defect here. The model that I'm going to select is going to match that because the fields are most likely compatible now. And we'll click Save. Now that we've clicked Save, we're not quite done. We could say done because most fields are automatically mapped. But we're going to go ahead and select map fields because while they are automatically mapped, there's a few fields that are automatically mapped. We can go in now and say and configure the fields that are not fully mapped. Now, the reason it's not fully mapped is they're called different things. What we're going to do is we're going to connect the appropriate fields from the application into Integration Hub. And to do that, we simply say, select a field. These two we'll say is our Sev1, and you can do it multiple to single. We're going to say that a blocker is a Sev2, a normal or minor is a Sev4, and a normal we'll say is a Sev3, and we'll leave unclassified as Sev5. And then we also have one more to set, and that's any unmapped value. We're going to set that as a Sev5 as well. Now, all the fields are mapped, so they will synchronize properly. And then we go to our second field here that needs to be configured, and we're going to go in and do the same thing. Now, note that some of these are already mapped, except a couple are not. So the blocker, we said this before, critical, we're going to leave that to high. We're going to leave blocker at 2, or at high as well. in this case. And then unassigned, we're going to leave over to low. And then we're going to map anything that's not mapped into low as well. Now we've configured our fields, and now all of our fields are correct. We're going to go back and look at our field mapping, and now we're done. At this point, we now have a collection that has been mapped, and that collection will drive the integration between the two applications. And we're done with our collections. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove that because we've already got all of our fields done correctly. And at this point, we created integration. We have several things already created in our integration. If we look at our models here, note that we are showing feature epic and we're showing story and task. Now, adding a new integration is very easy. If you don't have these showing up, it really doesn't matter whether you have them or not. You click new integration, select work item synchronization, you name this something, and then you choose your existing repository, your new repository that you're going into, the other side of the application, and then you choose the collection that is appropriate for each one of those. In this case, we've already done this, but we could select epic, story, or task from either side. Again, we want them to match epic to epic, story to story, task to task. Once we selected that, we click save, and then that becomes our new integration. But again, we've already got 3 configured here that are running, so we'll leave that alone for now. The other thing we want to talk about real quick is once you have configured the integrations, you can then check the activity. What I find is that there will be some times where you've got some failures. There's going to be a processing queue, and then there's going to be a failed and or completed queue. If the process fails, you will be able to select that. It will then show you in the activity column what's happening, the same way it will if it's completed, what has happened, when it happened, and whether it was successful or a failure. At this point, you can see that 26 artifact activities have been completed. If we make a change to one of our projects, let's go ahead and look at our JIRA backlog, for example. Or we can look at our EWM, either one, it doesn't really matter. Let's say we want to go into our backlog here, and we want to create an issue in the backlog. And we're going to call this new task related to this project. Now we've added our task. If we look at that task and look at the details of that task, we can go to the right here and see that there aren't very many details yet. We can add a parent. One thing I want to note is with JIRA, in the standard version, you basically have tasks and stories are both at the same hierarchical level, which means that you can only have an epic as their parent. So we'll go ahead and put that as the parent. Whatever information you put in here that you've mapped will also transfer over to our EWM project. That takes about a minute. If you look in here, we had 26. Note now that we have 27. This was updated. So 26 previously, 27 activities have completed. So we should be able to see, if we go into, we can actually go into our our quick view planner under our Beehive workboard. We'll see that in sprint 1 here, we have our new task related to this project. And we can open that up. It is currently, as we saw in sprint 1, if we look at our link here, the parent is the Beehive weight monitor here. So that's pretty much how you integrate, how the integration works. We can go back again and see, did that? Yep, we had that in sprint 1. So it automatically saw that sprint 1 connected into sprint 1. That's pretty much it. You can see here that the data has been copied, and it is regularly copying over. The integrations run automatically until you stop them. You can stop them individually or all together. And that's the integration.